We recently tested our country's financial knowledge, and to do that, we used something called the Big Three questions.
They measured the most fundamental concepts behind every financial decision.
40% of people couldn't answer all three questions.
Ignorance is not bliss.
How do you get across to people the real-world impact is of not having this knowledge? Hi. At the Richmond Project, we're committed to helping to improve Britain's financial literacy because we think that's a fantastic engine to drive social mobility. We've recently tested our country's financial knowledge, and to do that, we used something called the Big Three questions. Now, this is the global benchmark for how best to test a country's financial literacy. These three foundational questions were developed by one of the world's leading experts on financial literacy, who I'm delighted to say is here with me today. And in a rare turn of events, I'm the one that gets to ask her the questions. So, Professor Lusardi, thank you for joining us. You obviously developed these Big Three financial literacy questions together with one of your colleagues, Professor Olivia Mitchell. So please just tell us a little about what are these Big Three questions and why those are the right way to measure financial literacy.
We didn't call them the Big Three at the beginning, but I'm glad they have become the Big Three because they measure the most fundamental concepts behind every financial decision making. So they are about numeracy, the capacity to do calculation using interest rate. They are about inflation and whether people understand you are losing purchasing power when inflation is higher than the interest rate you can get on your savings. And they are about risk diversification. So, three, but they are able to measure the ABC of personal finance.
Okay. So the Big Three, inflation, compound interest, risk diversification, are the way that we test how competent we are or confident we are with financial literacy. I was surprised, and I'm sure other people will be surprised. How can you make it so simple? Reduce this down to just three concepts. How did that come about? Was there a moment where you just realized, actually, these are the three things that matter, or this is how we can do it?
Well, it was a constraint we were imposed upon when we wanted to measure financial literacy. We were told you can only have a small module. And we thought that was a major constraint that forced us to think very, very hard about how can we measure financial literacy with just a handful of questions. And this is where we then drill down to the most fundamental and, by the way, universal concept. What we thought was a constraint turned out to be a major asset because you can add three questions to almost every survey. Probably not five. Two would be too little. And so three was actually a good number to measure this basic but fundamental concept. And they are able to differentiate among level of financial knowledge.
So let's get into that differentiation. We've obviously tested these Big Three questions here in the UK, I think for the first time, certainly at this scale. And what we found is 4 in 10 adults, so 40% of people, couldn't answer all three questions correctly. And there were big gaps, whether it was by gender, socioeconomic status. When you hear that 40% number, how are we doing relative to other countries? It would be interesting to get, you've done this all over the world. At those levels, what kind of countries are better than us? Where do we fit in the international rankings?
So first of all, you mentioned, these are three simple questions. At the end, they are not simple at all, right? People really lack this fundamental knowledge. And I have to say the UK is very similar to many of the other countries, many of the countries of the G7 bloc, many of the countries including the US. So in the US as well, we have a high proportion of people who are not financially literate. So I think this is the problem that these Big Three have revealed, that we cannot take this knowledge for granted, even in countries with very well-developed financial markets like the UK or the US.
And when you looked at the data from the UK, was there anything that jumped out at you where we were an outlier, where we looked quite different to other countries, either in Europe or like Australia or Canada, either for the better or the worse?
So when it comes to financial literacy, I say the world is flat, to paraphrase Thomas Friedman, meaning countries are very similar. So I have to say there is nothing striking about the US. The gender gap we see is similar, even though it's relatively large in the UK, to other countries. The fact that the young know little, or the fact that those with low income and low education know little, is very similar to other countries as well. So there are striking similarities when it comes to financial literacy, which I think is due to the fact that, you know, we don't have this topic currently in the schools, and so people have to learn by themselves.
And you make a great point there, and I wanted to get at that with you. What's driving these differences we see between ages, between countries, between genders? Is it culture? Is it economic? Is it education? You know, when you've looked at this, you know, what's really driving these differences?
Let me start with one of the differences I'm very passionate about, which is the gender difference. And this is where international comparisons are so important. Because we saw this gender difference in every survey in the US, but we didn't focus on it until we saw the international evidence. There is a gender difference in every country. And so we realized that this is truly gender. And to understand what was going on, we tried to look at these questions a little more, and we found that women, for example, in all of the countries, disproportionately were more likely to answer the financial literacy question with I do not know. So they weren't necessarily answering incorrectly, they were less confident about the answer. So we could even measure how much of that gender gap is due to confidence, and I can say is 1/3. So in the countries in which we have studied this, I think for the rest, I like to use the word you have used, culture. I think these culture differences probably play a role to explain some of this gender difference, but we don't have a complete explanation for that.
It's fascinating what you said about the don't know answer, and particularly when it comes to women, indicative of a lack of confidence, actually, rather than knowledge. And that's something that you've seen in multiple countries, is it?
It's there everywhere. It's there in countries with, more equal education system. It's there in countries, with high income and low income. It's there in Finland. It's there in Italy. It's there in France. And it's there in the US as well, where women participate to the labor market. So there is something very specific. Yeah. And I see this when I speak to my female friends. And when I talk to them about money, I see this lack of confidence. I see this discomfort almost. And this is why I've made it such a big objective, to really try to make this topic be a lot more normal, a lot more, something that we do. And we do talk more often. When I go to my classroom, for example, the first thing I tell the students is, okay, let's talk about money, to try to make this topic more approachable.
Well, as a dad of 2 young girls, I grapple with this, confidence at home as well, and I can see that. So it's brilliant that you're focusing on that. I have to ask, which is the question that is the hardest? Or maybe it's more than one question in different countries, but is there one question that across the board is the trickiest one?
Yeah. Of the big 3, the one which is hardest for people to grasp is risk diversification. It's true across countries. We have done a global survey about 10 years ago, and we found that this topic disproportionately is the one that people have more difficulty grasping, and it's truly more complex. Risk is more complex to understand, but it's also so consequential, right? I mean, risk is around us, and a lot of the financial decisions is about, in a sense, diminishing that risk, insuring against that risk. And so, that knowledge is really, really important.
Which brings us nicely on to the consequences of not having this knowledge. And if you don't understand these 3 concepts, risk diversification, as you mentioned, or compound interest or inflation, what are the real world consequences? Because I think with financial literacy, it's important to remember this is not some abstract concept. This impacts people's everyday lives and their futures. And how do you get across to people what the real world impact is of not having this knowledge?
I always say in finance, ignorance is not bliss. And what we do see in all of our studies is that financial literacy affects from the simple decision to the more complex decision. For example, it affects whether people have precautionary savings, whether they have put aside, some saving
money for a rainy day.
The money for a rainy day. At the end, it's not a complex concept. But when we look at the data, it's so linked to financial literacy. People who are more literate, looking at the big three, are disproportionately more likely to have that buffer stock of saving, which, by the way, turned out to be so helpful during the shutdown of the economy, right? During the pandemic or during, shocks. It's very linked to, for example, also long-term planning.
I mean, exactly. We all have aging societies
right.
in Western European countries. So planning for that retirement and not working is really important for people. So presumably that is a big impact of people not understanding things like compounding or inflation eroding your savings means that you can't plan properly for your retirement.
In fact, this is the first study we did. When we look at the big three, in our module, actually, we link financial literacy to retirement planning because we were exactly looking at the fact that, the pension system has changed so dramatically, shifting the responsibility onto worker, how much to save and to invest in the pensions. And we realized that decision is so linked to financial literacy, but also investing decision, insuring decisions, being able to avoid scams is very much linked to financial literacy. So in other words, it's linked to the decision that you have said we make every day.
Yeah, at this point,
it's very consequential for our life.
I think this point actually on scams is really well made. I certainly see it as a MP in my local area and my constituents talking to me about financial scams, which obviously are growing as more and more people are online. This is the best defense against being scammed, is having an understanding of good financial literacy, I would imagine.
To use a football analogy, it's the first line of defense against scams. And I also want to mention why the elderly might be an ideal target for scams. When we look at their financial literacy, it's actually quite low, mostly because there is some declining, cognitive ability decline later in life. When we ask them about their own financial literacy, how they assess it, they actually think it's very high. So there is a disconnect between what people think they know and what they actually know. And the problem is these are the people who have the wealth.
Right, and that's particularly attractive for scammers.
Absolutely. I mean, in a sense, the elderly are, unfortunately, ideal target for scam, given this gap, and I think are really the group that we need to protect.
While we're talking about the elderly, one of the age gaps I noticed in the research was adults, not quite the elderly, but adults, the more mature phase of their life, were more financially literate than younger people who had much more education than them.
Yeah.
And it seemed to be that actually there was, whether you're in your 40s or 50s, even if you didn't benefit from a lot of formal education, it was possible that you were more financially literate than people who were much younger who did. That was a surprising finding in one sense to me. Is that something that you see everywhere?
Yes, we see this overall. We see this inverted U-shaped profile. In other words, the young have the low level, and then in the middle age you have this higher level, and then it declines with age. Why is the case? Is because people learn from experience. But what I would say, what we see is that overall, that learning from experience is not a lot. Even if you look at the level of financial literacy, even later in life, right, it's not very high. And I think the reason is some of these financial decisions are not made frequently. Like, we don't retire many times, right? We don't buy many homes, right? We don't buy many cars. So it's hard to learn from experience because, financial decisions are not like going to buy the milk, right? And things like that.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And I guess that kind of brings me to my next question, which is, we've talked a little about the problem. We understand the problem. We understand that it matters, and we've gone through some of the consequences. And we know that it's a global problem. So what do we do about it? You know, what are the best ways to actually improve this situation? What works?
So first of all, I always say financial literacy or improving financial literacy is not mission impossible. It's very possible, I think, to address this problem. And I think it has to start in school. You know, I think the reason why we see this lack of knowledge is because we are not catching up with the changing world in front of us. And school need to adopt, need to change, need to have financial literacy. I think this will not only increase the level, but I think it will also try to close some of these gaps that we see. You know, people are financially literate because they might learn this from home, but this is mostly if you have rich parents. Women are not going to, you know, probably talk about financial literacy at home or with their female friends. And so if we have it in the school, we can reach the younger population before they make financial decisions, so people don't have to learn from mistakes. And it's an investment as well for the future.
And it builds a good, strong foundation for the future.
Does.
And have you seen countries around the world that have done this and then seen the benefits in a more financially literate population over time? Are there a couple of good examples?
So first of all, we did a big study and we look at all of the financial literacy program. We did what is called a meta-analysis, and the reason is now financial education and financial literacy is so prevalent in so many countries. And so we were able then to focus on the more rigorous evaluation. And what I think I saw is that financial education, first of all, works. It works both in school and it works also for adults. So I want to dispel the myth that, you know, like this is difficult to do or anything like this, and it is also cost effective. You know, if I have to think of, you know, which countries have done it. So for example, we work a lot with New Zealand, which many years ago really implemented a lot of reforms when it comes to financial literacy. Interestingly, it was the pension commissioner who was in charge of financial literacy because they saw how important it was for planning for the future. And they implemented a big program, you know, also that had financial education in the schools. So I think programs that are visionary and that really try to put it in the school. By the way, I want to say the school doesn't reach only the young. You can reach the parents, you can reach the teacher, and you can reach your own community. And I see it in my students as well. You know, the first generation student bring this knowledge at home. The female student, when they get financial literacy, they spread it to their own community. So there is a multiplier effect when we go to the school. Some countries have also implemented financial education in the workplace.
Well, that's what I was going to ask about adults. So it's easy to reach children because you know where they are, they're at school, and we can get to them. What about adults? You know, what's the best way to provide them with financial education if you're not doing it through the school and through their children?
I want to use here my experience in Italy, where I had the financial education committee in charge of designing a national strategy for financial literacy in Italy. One of the things we learn is you have to be where people are. Yeah. And so, for example, in Italy, we have a lot of museums, right? And so more than 5,000 museums. So now we have a museum of savings as well. It's in Turin, and the Bank of Italy is designing another museum. And during Financial Literacy Month, we actually had a month dedicated to financial literacy. We had an exhibition about money almost everywhere. And, you know, and we went to talk to people where they are. In fact, we opened Financial Literacy Month with a big, exhibition at a theater, actually talking about money. By the way, we did put financial literacy into some of the national TV. So there was a soap opera that people really like. It was called Un posto al sole. Which was literally an Italian soap opera.
So your kind of Italian version of EastEnders or Coronation Street over here, okay. Or Neighbours and Home and Away in Australia.
Yeah, in a very similar, very simple, but, people were watching it. And we also did, actually, we applied to the European Commission, we got a grant, and we did a web series a la Netflix, Okay, so where people live in this condominium and they had all this financial issue, and there was this econ professor that lived in the condominium that people would go to and they would speak of their decision and so on. Because I really think that we need to make financial literacy as one of the things that we do, in the same way we take care of our health, in the same way we take care of other things.
That's a very nice analogy. We just need to make it as normal as all these other things. And that's
absolutely.
a better way to...
And we need to be where people are, where people go to learn.
And you mentioned in that vein people's workplaces. And that seems to be a good route if you can work with people's employers to bring programs to their workplace.
So we work a lot with the workplace and with the employer in the US. So we even work with a company, which is a Fortune 25 company. What I think is great there, you can operate at scale, right? I mean, this big company have a lot of people, right? What we also document in our research is that workers spend quite a bit of time at work worrying and dealing with their own personal finances. So we always told the employer, this is not charity work. In any case, people would be potentially less productive because of these money worries. If you look at surveys from psychology, one of the major worry in the US is money worries. Right? And so this can affect health, can affect stress, and so on. So it has real consequences. So it's beneficial. It's a win-win
for the employers as well
to do this. And by the way, Stanford as well as a financial wellness program for their employees.
Well, that's excellent. Last thing from me is, if there's someone watching this and they're thinking, I would like to get better at this, or I'm not sure I could answer those 3 questions and I'd like to learn how to do that, what's your advice to them? So
first of all, I think of these big 3 as a checkup, right? Like, it's just a way to assess, but do I have the knowledge? And this is why we want to measure, right? I mean, measurement is very helpful, and so I would like people to indeed take the test. And then, as every checkup, if you don't do well, you have to make changes, right? So, my recommendation is, invest in knowledge, invest in yourself, invest in, better habits and making this situation better. And we have designed actually a bigger checkup where we have like 7 steps. Apparently 7 steps are many steps you need to achieve some objective. And so I also would recommend people, if they go on our website, which is the Initiative for Financial Decision Making at Stanford, we have a financial health checkup where we ask people, are you doing this? Are you doing this? And we give specific also suggestion on what they can do in order to take very simple step, I would say, toward financial well-being, toward financial success eventually. So I think this is a simple checkup to start doing better, to start being more confident in the decision, and also to start making the type of decision that might make life and the situation better.
Well, you've been absolutely brilliant, and I think people should remember also what you said right at the beginning of this conversation, which it's not mission impossible.
It's not.
So everyone, I think, with the right support can get more confident with these concepts and financial literacy in general, and thereby have a, I think, much more secure and fulfilling life. Is there anything else we haven't talked about, Professor, that you think is important for people to understand about this and your work and how to improve things?
So I want to mention 2 things I always tell to my students. So first of all, we teach personal finance at Stanford, and I'm very happy to teach this course with one of the most famous professors at Stanford, Professor Michael Boskin. Started this course, and now I'm joining as well. So one of the things I always tell my students at the beginning, I ask them, what do you think this course is about? And I know, in a sense, what the students say. First of all, my female students often do not answer this question, so I solicit the question and the answer. And, most of the people think that this course is about investing.
Right.
It's probably because they hope we can give them some good tips about investing. And some other, in particular, the female student, they think is about managing your finances, for example, debt and debt management.
Right.
Because as you know, in the US, people start with student loan and so on. And so I look at them and I said, you know, this course is a happiness project. It helps you to make good financial decisions so you can achieve your objective, so you can be more confident and you can make good, savvy financial decisions during your life, which is probably going to, you know, make you potentially even achieve what you would like. So that's what we are doing here.
Wow, what an inspiring way to finish. Thank you so much for your time. I'm very privileged to spend this amount of time with you. Thank you for your work on this area, and we at the Richmond Project look forward to working with you as we go forward.
Thank you very much. We look forward to working with visionary leaders like you. You know, this really takes leadership. We need leaders and we need visionary leaders to embrace this topic because some of these benefits are far into the future. But it is an investment that we need to do for our country, for our young people, and for a better future.
Brilliant. Thank you.